It just takes a moment or two to get that going. So as it turns out, this Sunday ended up being the best possible day for us to be running this program. And the reason why is because yesterday was the first Shabbat where both Adat Israel and Bet Tikva ran virtual services on Shabbat straight to the internet. This was not planned. We'd actually hoped to have this conversation about a week ago. Didn't work out. This Sunday ended up being perfect for us. And so my first question to you, Rabbi Grover, where is your synagogue at with all of this, with the virtual programming, virtual services, virtual shul? And what was your process to get to where you are right now?
Okay, and then I'll ask you the same question so we can compare and contrast the complexities of our boards and synagogue governances. First of all, thank you to Rabbi Cutler for being a part of this, and to Adat Israel for hosting this event. And I think this is the first kind of event we've done like this with both of our congregations. So I hope it is the first of many, many more.
Our shuls have a long history of cooperation and rabbis having conversations, so I certainly hope so.
Yeah. At Beth Tikva, we actually started talking about live streaming way before we heard about this thing called a coronavirus. We have been, I would say, there are certain families in the congregation that had been tuning in frequently to live streams from other congregations in the States. And they did so sometimes because they were unable to come to synagogue because of health concerns. Sometimes they didn't have the time to make the schlep to shul, and some of them probably didn't want to get dressed up. So it's easy to log into a service from some of the congregations that were already live streaming. And there were, as I reviewed some of these synagogues and what they were doing, there were some really impressive live streams coming out of the larger congregations, I guess, with the bigger budgets. It's like a television show when you tune in, and well produced, great sound, different camera angles, and you can, from the comfort of your home, get somewhat of a synagogue experience. I think those families were advocating, particularly those who were unable to come to synagogue for health reasons, were asking us to be able to find some way of connecting them back to shul. I guess the other strong motivating factor, these bar mitzvahs where a grandparent or someone else in the family is traveling from very far and can't make it. And the families would say, I wish there was some way we could connect my cousin in Israel so that he would be able to see the service. So what they did a couple of times, not on Shabbat, but weekday bar mitzvah, they'd stand there with their phone and would stream the service from the sanctuary. Eventually, we took the proposal to the ritual committee of our synagogue, I think probably about a year ago, and started talking about live streaming and what it would look like. My concerns at the time with live streaming, the same ones I have now. I didn't want people choosing live stream and not coming to synagogue. And these synagogues that I was referring to earlier, sort of these large synagogues in New York with multi-million-dollar budgets and a huge part of that budget devoted to live streaming, they had different aims and goals than the goals we had. We wanted to make this accessible to people who were unable to come to synagogue. I think those larger synagogues wanted to create a whole online community such that many more people were streaming online and joining their communities online, even more than were attending services in person in the sanctuary. And so we created a policy, and the wording, I think the head of our ritual committee is on the call tonight. He'll correct me if I get the wording wrong. Hi, Steve. I think the wording was for health reasons. Well, then coronavirus comes along, and everyone's got a reason not to come to shul for health reasons. And I think we were literally a week or two from installing the camera, again, just for those who were not able to come to synagogue. We were going to privately send them a link, maintain a list of the 5 or 6 people who wanted to tune into our service, send them the link and have them participate. Well, everything had to be reconsidered. And the motion actually didn't need to be changed because a pandemic qualifies as a health reason. It's just that I guess my fear level went from a 2 up to a 7 because now instead of services being attended by a select few through live streaming, we were considering what it looked like yesterday, which is that there are more people tuning into our services from that camera on the top of the ceiling than there are physically present in the sanctuary. And there are a whole bunch of other considerations that I think we have to think about when we're talking about the majority of our audience coming from a camera and not from the seats. And we are still thinking about those, and I think that's what's leading to this conversation, because Rabbi Cutler knows that the whole time I've been nagging him in the past few months, what are you doing at Adat Israel? How do you feel about this? Are you worried about this? How can we stop this from getting out of control? This dates all the way back to Passover, if you all remember Passover, all the way back from Passover and questions about how do you participate in a Seder, to today's questions, which revolve around participation at services that are now starting to resume, but all of us are limiting attendance and want to encourage people, especially those who are vulnerable, to tune in through the camera and not be physically present. So why don't you share with us, Rabbi Cutler, about your experience at Adat Israel and how you dealt with these questions?
Sure, thank you. I want to mention to everyone that the timing for this evening is we'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for questions for about 15 minutes at the end. So if you would have asked me 5 months ago if there was any chance we'd be installing any sort of live streaming equipment into the Adat Israel sanctuary, I would have laughed you out of the room. I mean, there was no chance. This is not something which was on my radar screen, not something I was interested in doing. Though I always had, or long have had, this feeling that I'd love to be able to bring in those who really would love to be in shul and can't, those who find themselves in a hospital on Shabbat and wanted to be there. It was just not something which I was thinking about, not something really anyone in shul was talking about seriously. And then COVID-19 happened, and I think it took us all a little bit of time to realize this was not a 2-week or even a 4-week timeout from shul, that this is going to be a long time. And the opening is going to be slow, and a lot of people are going to be hesitant to come back for a while. At which point the calculus started to change. And it, I think, struck all of us that we needed to be providing for our members, that there was a demand from them to be in shul, and we wanted to continue to support them and connect them with the shul, which is, of course, right behind me. I'm sitting in the sanctuary right now. No. Mm-hmm. And certainly other shuls, of course, were doing the live streaming. And one thing which we as a shul decided as the clergy, and certainly myself as the senior rabbi, is we weren't going to count like you as well. You don't count a minyan by counting screens. That is, we really wanted a minyan of 10 physically present together. And that would be our minyan rather than counting screens, which we know other shuls are doing. And so that actually pushed us a little bit to see how we could possibly open up after last week's announcement that houses of worship could fill to 30% building capacity. And so yesterday morning, we did a trial run. We had the live streaming equipment installed literally Thursday afternoon, and Friday we were doing all the tweaks. while the actual permanent camera is still, I think, in China. This is some temporary equipment. And we did this trial with just the clergy, our medical advisory committee, our executive director, a few key lay leaders, and our Rabbis, to see what this would look like, going through all of our protocols, which we had been developing over time and had to really put them to paper and enact, with the hope that we can live stream weekday and Shabbat into the future with the minyan in the building. And we're going to start, small with 20, and we'll see from there. So I share your concerns. I know you started talking about this. The concerns of what does this mean long-term for shul? When it's easy to click and join, is that really a community? It's one thing to I can't be there this Shabbat, so I'm going to live stream in, but otherwise I'm there. It's another thing to make this your regular routine. And I was visiting with Rabbi Schilder, Rabbi Emeritus last week. We sat on his front lawn, 10 feet apart. And we were talking about this. And his comment was that long-term, this could be the end of shul as we know it. He said, what's going to stop someone, the greatest chazan in North America, will daven from Cincinnati, and the entire continent will just watch.
Right.
Why do we need shuls if everyone can just go to this one place? There's still going to be a demand for community, but we know that participating in sports is different than watching the sports live is different than watching at home. And not that I want to compare shul to sports, but it's something which I think many of us can understand. It's simply not the same. So that's where we're at today.
and you mentioned something very interesting, and I want the people on the call really to hear this, because I think the two of us are on the exact same page with regards to the way Kaddish fits in to this discussion. Adith Israel and Beth Tikva decided that we're going to take advantage of the loosening of restrictions. Other synagogues have not. And at that interview, they asked me, Shura was saying he saw me on TV earlier. The reporter asked me, why are you doing this now? Why not wait? And I said, we have people who have not had the morning rituals that help people cope with loss. They haven't had them for months. The best they've done is click on Zoom and have some artificial community there, and they're saying some version of the prayers that we usually recite for mourning. It's for those people that we want to make sure that we have a really good excuse if we're not going to reopen. But if there's room anywhere to bring community back together and help restore some of these mourning rituals for those who've experienced loss, we should take advantage of that room. The principle of counting people who are actually present is something I think Rabbi Cutler has experienced. I experienced it when I lost my mother, and found within the minyan a caring community of real presence and comfort when you've experienced loss. And I'm sure many of us on this call have experienced, if they've had a loss that's been painful, and they've decided to follow the ritual of coming to shul to say Kaddish. When Rabbi Cutler talks about everybody joining in and going to see the Chazan in Cleveland. Cincinnati, excuse me. Well, when I think of you, I think of Cleveland.
My wife's from Cleveland.
Right. Everybody going to Cincinnati, you are losing something that I think should concern all of us. The decision that I think our congregations made not to count screens, but instead require physical presence. It wasn't just based, I don't want to speak for you, Rabbi Cutler, but I know for me, it was not just based on what the Mishnah said or what the Gemara said, but we're thinking to ourselves, what is the difference between physical presence and virtual presence. This has been, by the way, a very hard sell, and a lot of congregants have been after me. Why aren't you counting screens? It's a pandemic. It's a crisis. We should be enabling people to say Kaddish counting screens. But I want people on this call to appreciate the other side of the argument. It's exactly what Rabbi Cutler was talking about. There is something different about being there, seeing your actual face move, being near other people, feeling around you the spirit of a synagogue, the spirit of worship in community. And I'm sorry, but I don't think that can be replicated on Zoom.
But at
So
the same time, I'm going to cut you off.
yeah, sure.
That the question is, who's our audience for our services? So this past Shabbat, we had 17, 16 people in the sanctuary, and well over 10 times that in terms of screens watching, presumably watching, we don't know, in their homes. And so in a lot of ways, the audience that we're trying to create actually isn't the one in the sanctuary. People coming to shul are actually serving the people who are watching at home to allow them to have a service in which there's a minyan present in the shul that they then can participate in from home. And I think the language is important. I've been thinking a lot about this. When I speak to the people who are watching at home, I try to actually avoid using the word watching or viewing. It's either joining or participating, because I don't want this to be totally passive. I want them to feel on some level that they're with us in shul, and I want us to feel that they are with us as well. I know we had spoken about earlier the concern for turning davening into simply a place to come and say Kaddish.
Right.
We both know that, of course, a lot of our congregants, they come to shul specifically to say Kaddish. And I think it's beautiful and wonderful that they choose to take on that mitzvah when that happens. And I understand that that may be their week or 30-day or 11-month commitment, and then coming back on your sites. And I'm super happy to see them. But of course, at its core, tefillah isn't about the Mourner's Kaddish. Mourner's Kaddish is a relatively new addition to our tefillah. And prayer itself goes back to the Torah. And so one of my concerns, and this is a concern for you as well, is the more we bend the rules, counting screens, saying whatever it might be, the more we turn the ikar, the essence of tefillah, not about worshiping God, but as a place to come simply to say Kaddish. And I want to put this out there. I recognize I have never had to say Kaddish. Thank God, all my immediate family are still alive and well. And I know that on an emotional level, I can't have that conversation with a congregant who bugs me the same way that they bug you. And I mean bug in a nice way. Why can't we have a minyan of screens? Because I'd rather not have to go to another shul. And my selling point for a while, and I know it doesn't work for everybody, my selling point for a while was this little story I shared in the sermon of these two Rabbis in Tsarist Russia who are arrested one afternoon for no reason. They're thrown into a jail cell with a bunch of Russians. And one of the Rabbis starts, Ashrei Yosheveitecha, it's mincha time. And the other Rabbi says, what are you doing? You can't daven. He says, what do you mean? Well, they point to the corner and there is a bucket there that people are using for the bathroom. And of course, you're not allowed to daven in a space where there is a bathroom. At first, he's upset that he can't daven. But then, like a good chassid, he starts singing and dancing. And the other chassid starts singing and dancing, and the guards come near. And they're asking, what happened? What happened? And the Russians are saying, I don't know. They were talking about the toilet, and now they're singing and dancing. So the guards don't like the chassids. They take the toilet away. Now they can daven mincha. So what's the point of the story? Why were they dancing originally? They were dancing because for the first time in their life, they had the opportunity to fulfill the mitzvah of not davening. There are moments in our life when our patterns of life change. And we have new opportunities to do things differently that are actually required at that moment. And the tricky thing that I think our movement created by some rabbis allowing counting screens is they're now saying, well, if you have an obligation to say Kaddish, You're actually not obligated to join a screen, even though you might think that you can do something else instead. And it loses the sense of obligation, because that's that's what a mitzvah is. And now we're creating this shady gray middle ground saying, well, you could go and it'd be nice if you go, but you don't have to go, but it's available. And if you do, you count. And it's easier sometimes to say, and I think actually more authentic to our tradition, to say, if we can't safely say Kaddish, you don't have an obligation to say Kaddish. And thank God our tradition has alternatives that I think if you get into, it might take a day or two or a week. But if you commit to doing them, whether it's the Kamal Rachamim, the Kaddish written by Rav Amram Gaon 1,000 years ago, this becomes your morning ritual for the time being. And I think it fulfills not just the sort of halachic piece, but the emotional piece as well. So you're welcome to add something there, but I'm hoping actually we could talk a little bit about Zoom smachot, which I know both of us have engaged in. So what's been your experience with Zoom smachot?
So I've done a Zoom wedding. I've now done a Zoom bris. I did a Zoom baby naming for a
Well, let's
baby.
go back for a moment. The Zoom, you didn't do like the bris part.
No, we
Okay.
didn't. We haven't gotten the robotic arm
Okay.
yet that you can bring into your home. I'm sure someone is working on that somewhere in Israel. But we've done a, let's see, a Zoom funeral, Zoom shiva. I think by now, the full, we did a Zoom divorce. I can't forget about that. And you were with me, Rabbi Cutler, when we did a Zoom conversion. So I don't know what's left on the list. I think we've covered the entire Zoom life cycle,
Yeah.
the entire Jewish life cycle over Zoom. Actually, I think that in a lot of cases, these ceremonies, not worship, these kinds of ceremonies were virtual live streaming. Zoom actually facilitated the service in many ways. You don't have the people physically present at a bar mitzvah like you wish, but the families that we spoke to said, yeah, they weren't physically present, but my cousin in Israel, remember the one I was talking about earlier, he was able to watch the service. And we had many more guests than we expected because Zoom was able to, through Zoom, we were able to broaden our audience. So I think that's wonderful. Now, we figured that out during weekdays, but for Shabbat bar mitzvahs, we're still refraining from using Zoom because of the excessive amount of interaction that I think Zoom necessitates. But I think in general, if I was to make a prediction now, I think Zoom is here to stay for those life cycle events. Even when we get back to regular synagogue life, B'mheira b'yameinu, I hope we still have a Zoom option so that those relatives can still participate from abroad, or a live streaming option, which you have installed. One of those, because it really has improved, I think, the ability of friends and family to gather for these special life cycle events. Even funerals. How many stories do we know of families who were in a difficult position, needing to delay a funeral? You're not supposed to delay a funeral in Judaism, but some people ignore that because there's somebody coming in from Australia, and so they wait and wait and wait and wait. Well, I'd like to see the increased use of Zoom to enable relatives from far to participate so that burials can happen faster and we can increase in Kavod HaMet. So I have good reviews about Zoom life cycle events. And what about you?
So I do remember the first time, I don't know, 5, 7, 8 years ago, where I saw someone holding up their phone at a funeral, and it felt for the moment, I don't know if tacky is the right word, but it didn't sit. But turns out I got used to it. And I think as families sort of asked me in the years after, would it be okay if, or they would say, it's too bad because so-and-so can't come in, I would suggest it. They say, really, you can do that? I'd say, actually, I think it's a nice thing to be able to do. So I think you're right. I think Zoom smachot and other life cycle events or live stream are almost certainly here to stay. My first Zoom bat mitzvah, the family was just the family, and everyone was on the screen, and we did what we did, and I tried my hardest, and at the end, you click the leave meeting, and all of a sudden it's just gone. Right? And normally in a simcha, you finish, you schmooze, you talk with them, you have to go back to your whatever it is. There's a process of release, and I find with all these Zoom things, the click and I'm back in my basement is hard. Right. And I feel like I didn't connect with them in the way that I would have liked to. And I spent the next few hours really just not feeling good. And thank God the parents sent me an email that afternoon telling me how thrilled they were at how everything went. That the bat mitzvah girl had a great time, they had a great time, and other guests were so thrilled. And that made me feel much better. And since then, I have a chance to do several more b'nai mitzvah. I did a wedding today, although that was in person. You can imagine the changes they made from yesterday. They announced new wedding regulations to today. It's right. Craziness. We can make this work. It's not going to be the same, but I think that there's certainly there's value to be had there, for sure.
So let me ask you about the big elephant in the room. What about Shabbat and Yom Tov? You and I both have kids around the same age. We're trying to teach them in an age where technology is taking over everything, that there is more to life than your iPad and your cell phones and your devices. And part of the way that we get that message across is by making Shabbat a special day, a day where we focus on other things because we can't use technology. And yet, my own kids were asking me yesterday, how is that working? What are you using? Daddy, aren't you using the very thing you're telling us that we can't use on Shabbat? So how am I supposed to answer my daughter, Rabbi Cutler?
I think the hardest thing I'll say about this crisis so far with my kids has been their screen time, which went from 30 minutes a week maybe to 3 hours a day, because that's where school is. Right. And all they want now is the iPad, the computer, the laptop, and just prying them away is impossible. And I tell you, Rabbi Grover, Jacob, who's my oldest, now knows more about computers and how to use them than I do. Really, he figured it all out. He set himself up an email address. He invited me to join as a family member, but wow. He's the parent and I'm the child in this relationship online. It's unbelievable. And on Friday, my middle, Ezra, who is 5, he asked, I didn't even realize he knew what was going on. He asked if we can set up the computer so they can watch me the next day doing services, doing my job. And I sort of looked at Deborah and she looked at me and she said, we're not going to do that. I love having my family with me in shul, and I love that they get to see me on the bima, and they sometimes come and the kids run up, and it's sweet. But it's hard. Now, I think that there are ways of making it better. I think if you put the computer or however you're going to do it in a room you're not otherwise going to use, or you cover it up and you uncover it when you need it, and then you cover it up again. I think there are ways to make it feel like this is.
That's interesting. I haven't heard that before. Like you do on a stove, like you do on the plata, covering up the blech, right? If you go to a Shabbat observant home, sometimes the blech, the heating, what do you call a blech? A heating tray? A heating, whatever it is.
It's a sheet metal.
Heating tray. It has a knob. Most of them have a knob on to adjust the temperature. You can't adjust the temperature on Shabbos. So what are you supposed to do? You take a piece of aluminum foil and you cover the knob. It's supposed to be a reminder to you not to touch it. And that's interesting what you're suggesting. maybe cover the computer or cover the iPad as a reminder that we're restricting its usage, and not just giving it a wholesale pass.
And I think people should dress up like they would for shul.
Yeah.
I think that they should make this as close to shul experience as they can. But the cover itself, I would like to say, I'd like the cover to say something like, we're doing this for now, but this isn't a forever thing. And I was, in our first communication to the congregation, I was very clear, for the duration of this pandemic, not that there's going to be a specific end date, but that this isn't something that we want to continue forever. But we both know that the cat is out of the bag.
Yeah.
That we're installing equipment. It costs us money. Shuls like to use the thing that they pay for, which I totally understand. And we're going to be pressed to keep it going, both for the people who are in long-term care facilities and they'll never be able to come, and for the cousin in Israel, who, by the way, causes an extra, not causes, but it's a big question there. What does it mean to be davening shacharit when you're in Israel? And in Israel, they're already, Shabbos is almost
the next
over,
day, right?
Musaf, right? Like, what is this? What time zone are you in? This is a big question. When my congregants tell me I joined a wonderful shul in California, I think to myself, it might be a wonderful shul, but I don't understand what service you're doing, because
I can daven 3 hours late. That's great. Well, you said something to me.
We're going to be, and the reporting piece is going to be a real press.
Yeah.
And I made it very clear. There's an isur, there's a halacha of the
because of ketiva.
Exactly. The 39 things you're not allowed to do on Shabbat. One of them is ketiva, is writing, and we understand recording digitally to be a form of that. And so I was very clear, this cannot be recorded, it cannot be archived, and it happens live, and just like being live, it's lost. And we're going to be pushed also for B'nai Mitzvah. I want to, I see the camera back there.
Right.
Why can't we record this? And
we're
going to have to be strong if we think that this is important.
Sorry to interrupt. You said something to me a few weeks ago that I found very, very helpful, just to understand and justify what we're doing here with these cameras.
I just want to make sure everyone heard that Rabbi Grover said that Rabbi Cutler was very helpful.
I'm giving him a compliment, everyone. Okay. It's official. No, I did find what you said very, very important, and it helped me even to respond to my daughter when she asked me her question. You said, we're conservative synagogues with similar cultures. If this was an Orthodox shul and we told people it's Shabbos, there's daven on your own, for the most part, people would know what to do. They would take a siddur, they open up, they've davened on their own probably many, many times before when they've been away from their home communities. They would be familiar. If we were to tell our congregants it's Shabbos or it's Yom Tov or it's Rosh Hashanah, it's Yom Kippur, daven on your own, I think for the most part, our congregants, this is what you said to me, and I think you're totally right. Our congregants would go, well, I don't know what to do. What do I do? What does that mean, daven on my own? Do I just read the machzor? And even if I can read the machzor and try and muddle through the prayers, what kind of a Rosh Hashanah is that? What kind of an experience is that? Am I really going to get any meaning? Am I going to understand what Rosh Hashanah is about? So I think framing it that way, it helped me, because I think sometimes halacha is about choosing, what's the expression, the devil, help me, the devil you like, or the better of the two devils.
Someone write it in the chat.
I forget the expression. Choosing between two bad outcomes. The first is sort of allowing this usage of live streaming on Shabbat and Yom Tov. And I think we all understand, even my 9-year-old daughter understands the problem with that, because to restrict some things, the devil there you go. To restrict the usage of technology and then cover it up, it's hard for kids to understand the consistency there. And the logic. Does that really make sense? I mean, am I allowed or are you not allowed to use a computer? And by the way, we have experience in the conservative movement with that very question. We allowed driving on Shabbos, but we didn't just allow driving on Shabbos. We allowed driving to the nearest synagogue if it's not within walkable distance. But what did that turn into? For many people, it turned into you can drive on Shabbos or Yom Tov anywhere. And I think the fear in allowing usage of technologies that normally would not be allowed on Shabbat and Yom Tov is that we're opening up a slippery slope. Those boundaries won't be there. And then on the other hand, the importance of keeping people engaged with Jewish life, engaged with Torah and mitzvot, having them listen to the Torah reading, participate in a service, get some meaning out of Shabbat or Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Oh, and then you said something else to me. And what do you think would happen to our institutions if we told our congregants, you're on your own for Shabbat, for Rosh Hashanah, for Yom Kippur? And then what price would we be paying for our stubbornness on this issue? We would sacrifice our shuls, sacrifice meaning on Yom Tov, and I think for the most part, we would turn our congregants to another congregation's live stream where they did feel that their needs to connect to Jewish life were being fulfilled. So did I do an accurate job in representing your...
I'll tweak you in a moment, but
okay.
Both of us felt, as the senior rabbis of our shuls, the weight of the Jewish life of our congregants on our shoulders. And it's not ultimately just about, can I justify it halachically? It's also about what's right for our people and how we're going to help them live a rich, Jewish, meaningful life. And the answer is going to be different depending on what shul you're in, because the population is somewhat different. Right. And even though, I think we're both uncomfortable with this long term, but even on the halachic level, our congregants' Jewish spiritual well-being rests heavily on us. And I think we owe it to them to be as flexible as possible without, losing the baby with the bathwater, to allow that to happen. And that's how we ended up where we are with live streaming, starting this past Shabbat. I don't want to overgeneralize about our congregants and, our shuls versus the Orthodox shuls, but I do wonder the extent to which there is some truth in, who goes to shul to fulfill the obligation to pray and the preferred obligation to pray with the minyan versus who goes to shul to fulfill sort of the idea of the mitzvah of going to shul on Shabbos.
Right.
Right? And I think for a lot of the people who I talk to every shul on Shabbos, they come to shul because that's what you do on Shabbos.
Right.
And it's not necessarily because, and they're davening when they're there, but it's not necessarily because they want to daven and they want to do it with a minyan, because they just want to be in shul. And that's lost to some extent when you live stream, but it's the best you can do at that moment. But at the same time, being in shul yesterday morning with 17 people who couldn't shake hands, who couldn't hug, who couldn't talk to each other, and we're limiting singing, and we're going quickly through the service, and all these things, it's also a loss for those who are able to be there. It really doesn't feel the same. I was surprised on our last Shabbat that before we closed, I had congregants who said, "Do you mind, can I take a Siddur home?" Because they didn't own a Siddur. And, the shul for so many people it's not just a piece of their Jewish life, it's a major piece of their Jewish life. And if we don't go down this route, our congregants just don't have the opportunity to practice their Judaism in a way which is really the way that they're used to practicing.
So if one of your congregants asked you a question, Rabbi Cutler, I know how to daven on my own, but I miss seeing the shul. Can I log in to the Adath Israel live stream link on Rosh Hashanah just to see see the faces, of the clergy that I like, to hear the music that I like, what would you say to that congregant?
So first, what I will say to begin with is one of the things that we're trying to encourage is people to actually learn how to lead the high holiday services. And we have people who are already taking that on because, first of all, some people, without asking me, they're just not going to do it. They're not comfortable doing it. And they'd much rather have a local minyan that they can go to in person. Maybe in someone's backyard, it might be small, than having their screens on. So we're really trying that, and I think it's actually a nice solution for some people. I would still tell, I think, that person, if they want to come on, if they want to join, there is the aspect of minyan there. It's not exactly the same as being there, and I think it's worth noting that there's a 20 to 25 second time delay when you put something on live stream. It's just, that's the way it is. That's the internet for you.
Right.
So if you're joining along and saying amen, you're saying amen to something which happened 20, 25 seconds ago. But I still think it's, it should be on. Now, I gave instructions, et cetera, how to log in before Shabbat, ensure your computer doesn't go to sleep, all those things, because if we're going to do this, I think that there's a way to do it, a better way to do it than to wake up on Saturday morning and start clicking at that moment. How about yourself? What would you say to that congregant?
It's a tough one. That's why I threw it at you. It's a tough question. I probably would say to my congregant not to tune in. I think that somebody who's able to daven without live streaming could help people, his neighbors, and help his family create a meaningful service at home. Uh, I have to think more about what you said, because you're right. There is something to, well, but if I log in, I get to be part of a community. But that being part of a community comes at the cost of Hilul Shabbat potentially. So I don't know. I got to think more about it. But I think I'm very happy we're having this discussion, because in the least, what it's offering to our communities is a sense that this is a complex issue. This is not so obvious. I was actually very surprised to hear from a number of our colleagues that this was, for them, the obvious way we're going to move forward. Live streaming is the future. Let's embrace it. This is the way to go. This is the future of synagogue life. Get used to it. And I actually would rather encourage our members to have a conversation both in their own minds and with their families and loved ones, very similar to the conversation you're hearing tonight between Rabbi Cutler and myself. This is not a conversation that is so halachically sophisticated. I find it deals with Jewish values that the average Jew can really understand. What does it mean to be part of a community? What does Shabbat mean? How do I protect the sacredness of Shabbat, but at the same time find room in a time of pandemic to remind me that I'm still a part of a community and connected to Jewish life? And I actually think it's through an appreciation for the complexity of this issue. Like, if I see that people understand the complexities, I'm a lot more comfortable being permissive of sort of tuning in on Shabbat, even if you know how to daven, and those difficult questions of where I draw the line. If you understand the values that are at play, then I'm comfortable with people saying, I'll draw the line where I'm comfortable. It's the approaches that are very black and white that scare me. The approaches of, this is the future, let's just run with it. Or on the other hand, there's absolutely no grounds on which one could ever use live streaming on Shabbat or Yom Tov. I think those miss the whole essence of what we're trying to get at here. So I actually think we should have this conversation again and again and again. If this is going to be the future, at least in some respects, we should keep evaluating it, keep talking about it, and remind people that if we maintain, I think, a Jewish perspective that is a perspective that is based on underlying Jewish values when evaluating this issue. Sofa lehitkayem. In other words, the argument will continue because it's l'shem shamayim, because we know that the argument is all about how do we serve God and bring people closer to Torah and mitzvot. When it becomes about people making black and white judgments about what's good and what's bad for humanity, that's where I think we miss the point.
Okay. We're going to open up to questions now. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat box. I've noticed, I'm just sort of scrolling through now, a lot of people have been having some really interesting and great comments, so thank you for that. So waiting for questions. While they're coming up, one person asked about Zoom, and this is something which we actually changed for Friday nights. We were doing at Adat Israel, Kabbalat Shabbat, up to the point at which you have I felt you had to turn off your screens with Mizmor Shel Yom HaShabbat, the Psalm for Shabbat, when I think formally we would welcome Shabbat in. And we used to do it live to YouTube and Facebook, but there wasn't the interactive. And then we switched for this past Friday night to make it to Zoom so people could see each other and participate, be together in that way. And I think it was actually a nice switch. But we weren't doing it on Shabbat, and our plan isn't to do it on Shabbat. And then you lose the sense of being with your community, absolutely 100%. But for me, and maybe for you as well, Rabbi Grover, the challenges of people wanting to chat and type, then the person who's leading, changing what's being shown on the screen, right, automatically. I had a conversation with a rabbi who's near and dear to both of us, with Rabbi Joel Roth, who suggested actually much better, particularly during a time of pandemic, when it's Shadat Chak, it's a moment of real urgency, of emergency. It's much preferable to have someone who is not Jewish sort of pan or switch the camera angle than my voice activating where the camera is going to go. So that's, we didn't want to do Zoom, and I think we're comfortable with that for now.
Yeah, I think Zoom, part of what's happening in the course of these discussions at synagogues is finding those ways of restricting the usage of live streaming technologies, because by restricting them, we send the message that we're afraid, in a sense, of these getting out of hand. And I think one of the ways where we can make that distinction is by saying that live streaming services that involve more text input and more computer usage are worse than live streaming services that involve less interaction with a device. So again, part of this is chinuch, part of this is educating people, sending a message. And I think by distinguishing between live streaming services and creating live streaming services that are more in line with the respect due to Shabbat and Yom Tov, then we keep Shabbat and Yom Tov as sacred days in our lives.
So I'm looking at the questions now. One question about this: the Kohen status give dibs in terms of being one of the select few who can get to go to shul. So yesterday we had 17 people. We had 5 Kohanim in shul. They had to make sure the guests would have enough non-Kohanim to fill the other roles. And everyone had something to do except for some of the Kohanim. It wouldn't in my book. I think there is a long-standing practice. If there are, on a weekday, 3 aliyot to be given out, how do you give a hierarchy? Who gets the aliyah? So we talk about the chassan, the groom on his wedding day, the father of the bris, and then you go down in terms of people who have chiyuvim, who have obligations to say kaddish, et cetera, et cetera. So for us, if and when we get to the point where we are opening up to the general population, it's going to be by pre-registration, and then you're going to get an email saying you've been approved is the wrong word, but you're on the list. One of the things we're going to be asking during the registration process is, why do you want to come to shul tomorrow morning for shacharit? And if the answer is because I'm sitting shiva or I'm in shloshim, that will take precedence over someone who says, I just like coming to shul. Now, at some point, I want to have a little bit of a rotation. That is, the people who normally come to shul, I don't want them to be forever kicked out because all the mourners want to be there all the time. I want other people to have a chance to come. But to be honest, I'm certainly not convinced for the next little while that even though we'll cap it at 20, that we're going to come anywhere near that. I think for weekdays, a lot of people, especially the one normally we have 2 weekday shacharit services. Many of the people who come are exactly the people I don't want to come to shul right now, because they're 65 or older, or because they're not in the greatest of health. And that was our message to everyone. Now, we're not going to be telling people you're forbidden. I think people have human agency, and they have the right to decide for themselves what risk they're going to take for themselves. But strongly discouraged is the term from coming to shul. And if that means we're not going to have a minyan for a while, we're going to let people know who plan to come, we will not be having a minyan this Thursday afternoon, that we'd still love you to come to shul.
I too don't know about Kohanim, but I would really impress on everyone Rabbi Cutler's words about the vulnerable coming to synagogue. Both of us are very aware that our synagogues have high median ages, which means our congregations are particularly at risk. This is a time where we need those younger members, some of whom have sort of been in the background and letting their parents' generation take control and take the leadership and make the minions and everything like that. This is the time where we need our younger members to step up, because for every young and healthy person that says, I want to come to synagogue, and I'm not telling anybody who's not yet comfortable coming to synagogue that they should come to synagogue. If you're not comfortable, everyone has a right to their own tolerance of risk. If you're not comfortable, don't come to shul. But if you're going to IKEA and you're going to Canadian Tire and you're going everywhere else, and you are comfortable being out in crowds, and you're young and you're healthy, this is the time when we need our younger members to step up, because for every young person who comes to synagogue, that means an older person can stay home and can participate in the service in the safety of their own home, and not sort of feel the guilt of maybe I should come to synagogue in order to make that minyan. Because Rabbi Cutler, we opened up today our daily minyan, and we were on the border for Shacharit. We just made a minyan, and for Mincha Marav, we didn't make a minyan. I'm not sure if it's a reflection of people's readiness to come to synagogue. It might just be, as some of my members have stated, the rules are so complicated and the registration system, I need a few days to absorb how to actually come to shul. That might be what's being weighed here. But the people who are coming to shul, I thank them. It's wonderful. They're supporting community. But I would love to see more younger people step up at this time. They have to recognize that our older members have been making tremendous sacrifices in the past 3 months, and we can help them out by coming to shul. Even if we don't know the minyan, this is the perfect time to learn. You're doing a big mitzvah by coming, because you're allowing somebody who's in a more vulnerable state to feel good about staying at home and saying and participating in the prayers from home.
I think that's a really, really excellent point. And we'll see how things roll out at Adat Israel as we open up a little bit more in the future. And if we don't get that minyan, and I'm very hesitant. I think a lot of people are not going to come, and rightly so. I think that's a really nice message for those who can, who are comfortable and are in perhaps a safer age category, that they should be coming. We have a couple questions, and I think with that we'll come to an end in terms of the question and answering. So one question about davening outside. So I want to, 2 quick things. One, all of our equipment's inside, so the live stream wouldn't work so easily. The things are mounted and hooked up. But secondly, there are other security concerns about davening outside. And shuls in the course of the last 2 years spent a lot of money on security, and for good reason. And just because we have the challenge of COVID doesn't mean that we are less vulnerable to other security risks. And so I know for me, regularly holding davening outside, it wouldn't fly, and I don't think it would fly for our lay leaders who look at the security of the shul. And last question is zooming the 21st century version of the driving tshuva.
I
So,
want to take a stab at that one.
okay, can I throw a quick one in? Oh, go,
Yes, of course. Yeah, you go first. You go first.
Your member.
Okay, my member. Morley was asking, is Zooming not the 21st century's version of driving to shul? I'm going to say yes, and I'm going to say no. I think that the similarity here I referred to earlier. We tried with driving to draw a line in the sand and make community more accessible to those who lived far from synagogue. And I know what Rabbi Cutler is going to say. We paid a price for that tshuva. The loss of a tight-knit, close Jewish community was the price we paid for giving that allowance. And there was a fascinating issue of Conservative Judaism Journal back when Rabbi Cutler and I were at JTS, where there was a
No one's ever said that before. Fascinating issue of Conservative Judaism Journal. I just want to
one of the maybe the only one, but it was a review of the driving tshuva with responses from those who were considered leaders in the conservative movement. And everyone who wants to know the answer to Morley's question should read those responses and understand the price we paid for that driving tshuva. But what I really wanted to say is, think of the difference. The driving tshuva was designed to sustain our synagogues, right? To enable people to come to shul who didn't live in walking distance and thereby affiliate with the synagogue, be a part of the community, participate more in the community. That's what the driving tshuva is about. It seems to me that live streaming has risks that are, in fact, just the opposite. It's an easy way to disengage people from synagogue, to keep people away from synagogue, to turn them away from their own local shul and turn them to the cantor in Cincinnati. Let's be careful about taking two cases that I think are very different and equating them one to the other. With respect, Morley, I think that they need to be evaluated on their own terms.
So I would only add, I think there's a lot of people, and certainly a lot of rabbis, who if you ask them privately, Rabbi, otherwise I'm completely Shomer Shabbat. Should I drive to shul because I can't walk there? And the rabbi would say, no. The driving tshuva was written in the 1950s. It is not sacred creed to every conservative rabbi. If it were, then if it's okay, you would have all the rabbis potentially driving to shul. And if you look around at the conservative rabbis in this city, none of them drive to shul. And in fact, many of us have in our contracts that we have to live within walking distance of our shuls because our shuls don't want us to drive to shul. In a lot of ways, live streaming or zooming in, whatever it might be, halachically is much less problematic than turning on your car and lighting a fire in your internal combustion engine. So I think a lot of rabbis out there are seeing it as the 21st century version of the driving tshuva. And I see the similarities. And I also understand and accept what Rabbi Grover is saying here. But we have to remember there is a range of thought in terms of all these issues within the conservative movement. And I don't think it'll surprise anyone here that Toronto has historically and continues to be a little bit more of a traditional conservative community than elsewhere. So I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Grover for the last word, after which I'm going to leave the feed on. I'm going to turn the recording off. And if people want to stick around, say hi to each other, you're welcome to that. I'm going to put one of my kids to bed, though. So you'll continue to see Adif Israel in the background. And hopefully when I come down and he's sleeping, if you're still talking to each other, great. But if not, I'll just close it then. Rabbi Grover, the final word.
I want to thank you again, Rabbi Cutler, for facilitating this conversation. I guess as a final word, I want to say I think we live in a time where screens and technologies are overwhelming every aspect of our lives. and they are fundamentally changing the world we live in so many different ways. And if you didn't see it before, you certainly see it now during this pandemic, where so many basic functions of life have moved to virtual spaces. People are being replaced, relationships are being replaced, and the time that we are spending interacting with devices, and I'm aware that I'm complaining about this while I'm interacting with all of you on a device, but the time we're spending interacting with devices, which was dangerously high before, is just getting worse and worse. There is a cost, my friends, for this unending trajectory towards automation and computer generating of relationships and institutional spaces, etc. Um, and I worry greatly about where this is taking us. There is something human that can, about a hug, about a face to face conversation, about getting coffee with a friend, about being in a synagogue, feeling that space, feeling the sacredness, uh, the sense of connection with the past and to each other that we need to be in the shul to feel. And I hope that all of us, as we navigate the challenges of the day and move to a world that's increasingly now finding screens, even in the sacred spaces where we once said no screens, the sacred spaces and the sacred times when we say no screens, and now find these technologies sort of wiggling their way in. I hope we will be extremely cautious. And if we're going to spend more time on the screen watching services, at least do yourselves the favor of taking the same week you're going to be on the screen for 2 hours at shul, book 2 hours to have coffee with a friend, or to go visit somebody ill in the hospital, or to attend a mourner, or to dance at a wedding. I think that these are what the rabbi says. Mitzvot she'adam ochel protehem ba'olam hazeh. You eat their fruit in this world. In other words, you need to be present for these mitzvot in order for them to matter. A computer is just not going to cut it. And I think, those final words, it gives you a bit of a sense of where I'm coming at to this whole discussion. And again, thank you for your attention, for facilitating this. And I hope we keep exploring this issue because, like Rabbi Cutler said, I don't think it's going away anytime soon.
All right, so good night, everybody. I'm going to turn off the recording now and stick around for as long as you'd like. I'm sorry we can't offer you any refreshments.